You ready? In the timer. From the team. Grayson.
Yeah.
All right. Quote, the bottom line is that taxes are not the most important government contribution to the investment climate. It's the budget deficit. This quote from Bruce Bartlett, former senior official at the Department of Treasury in June 2011, outlines the importance of the revenue of the government when it comes to the investment climate. How taxes, unlike the affirmative team says, are not the single most important contribution to investment decisions and investment choices and investment growth. It's in fact how much more the government spends more than it brings in. We're going to be examining the truth of that in this speech and why the affirmative team's plan will in fact see substantial revenue losses and how this will in fact hurt investment in the end in the United States. Before we do that, we're going to be looking at the disadvantage of small businesses hurt. Small businesses hurt. Now, the affirmative team's plan sees a reduction in the corporate tax rate. Now, the problem is that most businesses do not pay the corporate tax rate. Small businesses tend to pay the individual income tax rate. This was confirmed by the IRS in 2008. In the 2008 tax year, 1.8 million corporations were taxed at corporate rates, whereas 30 million were taxed under the individual income tax. So this means that the affirmative team's plan only benefits a very, very small portion of corporations. That means that the rest of the corporations are at a large disadvantage given they give a benefit to some business and not others. They leave the small business hanging out to dry while giving a tax break to only some of the corporations. This leads to the impact of jobs lost. Jobs lost. Kelly Edmondson, a senior economist in community affairs at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, said in May of 2007, quote, data published by the United States Census Bureau clearly shows that the bulk of net new jobs are generated by firms with less than 20 employees. So that's a small business. She continued to say, from 1990 to 2003, small firms accounted for 79.5% of the net new jobs, end quote. So what this piece of evidence simply shows us is that historically, the small businesses, the ones that the affirmative team's tax cut actually ends up hurting by putting them at a competitive disadvantage, those businesses are the ones that grow the economy and create the most jobs. The affirmative team hurts those small businesses. That means that they end up hurting the economy. Now we'll go down to the second disadvantage, which is of substantial revenue lost. Substantial revenue lost. We're going to be taking a look at a few subpoints here. We'll start with subpoint A of tax rate cut. Tax rate cut. Now the affirmative team makes the claim that they cut the tax rate to 25% when you take the state taxes into account. So let's take a look at how that kind of tax rate would affect the revenue of the government. J.G. Gravel, PhD in economics, writing for the Congressional Research Service, analyzing Congressional Budget Office projections for corporate tax revenue. So if this is a projection from the Congressional Budget Office of how much corporate tax revenues are going to be over the next 10 years. So that's clearly the most credible source about federal budget issues. So she said in May of 2011, quote, the revenue cost of a rate cut from 35 to 25% is estimated at between $1.2 and $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years, end quote. So now, let's do a little bit of math and see how the affirmative team has actually ended up confirming this by their own concession. I asked in the first speech, when they believed that the revenue collected was $180 billion, I asked them how much revenue would be lost. They said $40 billion. So $40 billion is about one-fourth, just under one-fourth of $180 billion. Now, the Congressional Budget Office projected that we would get just under $4 trillion of corporate tax revenue over the next 10 years. So if you take away a fourth of that, it's $1 trillion, which is the number I just cited would be lost. They confirm this by their own math by saying that if it generates 180, it loses about a fourth, coming around to about 40 billion. So by their own math in the Congressional Budget Office numbers, we can see that this plan does indeed lose over $1 trillion of revenue over the next 10 years. This is being confirmed by not only the affirmative team, but the Congressional Budget Office. Now, the affirmative team's argument is that the economy will grow enough to offset this, which is what we'll be looking at in subpoint B, insufficient growth. Insufficient growth. Now, this expert writing for the Congressional Research Service, which is basically the official governmental agency for researching how specific policies will affect the economy, this specific person actually specializes in the economics of taxation, particularly the effects of tax policies on economic growth and resource allocation. So a very credible expert to talk on this topic. She continued to say, quote, estimates for a rate cut from 35 to 25% suggest a modest positive effect on wages and output, an eventual one-time increase of less than 0.2% of output. Revenue feedback effects from increased investment flows are estimated to reduce the revenue costs by 5 to 6%, end quote. So there were some numbers in there. Let's boil it down. First off, she said that reducing the corporate tax rate to 25%, if the affirmative team is right, and when you're talking about corporate tax burden, it means state and federal, so this applies. When you reduce the corporate tax rate to 25%, you get about 0.2% of increased output. That's very, very small economic growth. And the evidence continued to say that when you compare that to the debt being lost, it only regains about 5 to 6% of the revenue that we lose. So this means that we're left with still around $1 trillion of revenue being lost over the next 10 years. Now the affirmative team made the argument that this revenue is much better in the hands of the private sector than the government. Now while that might be true in an ideal case, our government is in a specific situation right now where we can't afford to be enacting fiscally irresponsible policies that lose us too much revenue, especially because of the debt crisis that we've been threatened with, such as in August back in 2011, that we faced an actual credit downgrade on our credit rating because of our revenue issues. We can't allow that to happen again. So this leads to the two impacts of why losing about $1 trillion of revenue over the next 10 years is such a harmful thing and is more important than any of the arguments the affirmative team has presented to you in today's debate round. The first argument, the first impact is that of investment undermined. Investment undermined. And I read a quote at the beginning of the speech. Let's read through it again. Bruce Bartlett, former senior official in the Department of Treasury, June 2011. He said, quote, "When government borrows, it takes funds out of the economy that would otherwise be available to finance domestic investment. The bottom line is that taxes are not the most important government contribution to the investment climate. It's the budget deficit," end quote. What this simply means is that when the government spends more than it brings in, it has to be able to borrow that money from someone to meet those spending needs, and ends up borrowing all of that money from investors in the United States, given they lend their money to the government. And as the evidence said, this hurts investment more than anything else. The reason for this is that a tax rate such as the capital gains tax rate or the corporate tax rate only affect a decision whether the investor is willing to invest. But when you take the money from them, they actually can't invest. It's not even possible for them to invest because the government has taken their investment funds. That's what the affirmative team's plan does. You're trading, what you're doing with the affirmative team's plan is you're trading a possible unwillingness to invest instead for an impossibility of investment. You're taking away the actual possibility. There's a much higher chance of investment under the negative team than the affirmative. The second impact of this disadvantage is impact 2 of debt crisis. Debt crisis. Now, let's take a look at a quote from Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles, co-chairs of the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, who said in March of 2011, quote, "If not addressed, burgeoning deficits will eventually lead to a fiscal crisis. If we don't act soon, the risk of a crisis will increase. If we wait 10 years, which is the timeline that we've looked at for the revenue loss of the affirmative team, let's continue. If we wait 10 years, the Congressional Budget Office projects our economy could shrink by as much as $300 billion, and spending cuts and tax increases needed to plug the hole could nearly double," end quote. So what this evidence shows us is that the United States is facing a debt crisis. At some point, we're going to have to deal with it. And if you side with the affirmative team in increasing the chance of this crisis, we will have to face massive tax hikes in the future in order to stop that debt crisis from occurring. The affirmative team, because they're increasing the risk of that crisis, are essentially giving you a tax cut now, but they'll give you a huge, massive tax hike later to try and stop the debt crisis from happening. What we need to do is enact fiscally responsible reforms, and the affirmative team doesn't do that. They enact a reform that will take us in the wrong direction, take us towards that crisis and huge tax hikes in the future. So for these reasons, that the affirmative team's plan, first off, hurts small business, the driving force of our economy, and second off, reduces so much revenue that investment is discouraged and we increase the chance of a debt crisis. Ask you to vote for the relative safety of the status quo with the negative team. Thank you.
How's it going?
I'm doing great. How are you, Greg?
Great, I'm doing wonderful. All right, now, what is the negative team's definition of a small business?
A small business? I'm not entirely sure. We can bring up a definition of that in our speeches.
Okay.
I have more evidence to support the point that small businesses are taxed under individual income rates, if that becomes an issue, though.
Okay, so if a small business is taxed under an individual income rate, then it must be an extremely small business, correct?
Not necessarily. We actually looked at data from the IRS that over 20 times as many businesses are taxed under individual rates than corporate rates.
Okay, now so the individual rates for these small businesses, what are those rates?
It goes up to about 35% under when you make $200,000 of revenue. There's different brackets in the income tax system.
Okay, interesting. Now, is it the negative team's stance that money is better in the private sector or in the government?
In a vacuum, in an ideal situation, it could be better in the private sector. In the situation that we're currently in, where we're facing a debt crisis, we can't afford to be enacting fiscally irresponsible policies that reduce the revenue in such a way that will increase the risk of such a crisis.
Okay, now, you brought that up in your two impacts, starting with investment undermined. Now, about that, now, how much investment will decrease in the United States?
Well, given the government borrows the money from investors will have about $1 trillion less over the next 10 years.
Okay, so the government borrows the money from, oh, okay, so what you're saying. Now let's talk about your subpoint we entered about insufficient growth. Now, could I see the evidence that said, it was talking about 1/5 of 1%?
It was actually 2/10%. Good.
Well, 1/5.
Sorry, yeah. Yep, so man. All right,
All right.
that's one right.
Okay.
There's also the static revenue cost in that card.
Okay, great, thank you very much. Okay, now, back to investment. Now, how does the United States government use revenue to increase investment incentives?
It's not necessarily that the government, when they increase revenue, they increase incentives, but when they lose revenue, they borrow that money from investors and take that money out of the private sector.
Okay, so the government only borrows money from the U.S. private sector.
Well, it borrows some money from foreign nations, but the majority of it is from the United States
Okay,
private
and
sector.
do you know how much, what percentage or what ratio is actually borrowed from the private sector?
I'm not entirely sure. My partner have numbers back at the table if this becomes an issue
Okay.
during the round.
Okay, so can I make it an issue right now?
If you want, we can bring up numbers in the 2 minutes.
Okay, we would love to see that. All right, now, how does the U.S. government? Oh, actually, I just said that. Now let's talk about the debt crisis. Now, the debt. What is the impact to a debt crisis? Is it another S&P downgrade or?
It's a variety of things. If the government decides to default on its debt, which is admittedly very unlikely, if they decide to do that, then you see the military being unfunded, benefits not being paid out, that sort of thing.
Okay.
What's much more likely is massive tax hikes and massive spending cuts in order to stop that debt crisis, which would hurt the American people by taking away vital services and increasing their tax hikes to unprecedented levels.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No further questions.